So I got used to following exactly what was happening at the moment. And that's necessary to understand what's happening in Israel and Gaza right now, because things are chaotic. They're changing all the time. And really, the truth is, no one really knows what's going to happen next. But I want to start with a little bit of just a sort of a general overview of, not really general, it's very specific to where we are right now. I'm not going to give a whole overview of the conflict. Everyone knows that already. I'm going to talk about where we are right now. And then I want to talk more in depth about the Gaza Riviera plan, because I think it's very serious. You can laugh at things, but I think it's very serious, and there are arguments for and against, and I want us to understand all of that. And then I want to step back and look at the broader situation. First of all, I think right now it's pretty miraculous that the ceasefire deal is still working. It's truly, I don't think most people thought it would even get to the end of phase one. And right now, I believe there are 6 more hostages set to be released. And then phase one ends and phase two begins. And phase two is supposed to see the full withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza, or at least not all of Gaza, but the main area. They could still be on the border closer in than what the situation was before. And essentially, the return to a Palestinian government. It is not specified that Hamas would be the government, but that's the only option right now. So Israel is essentially, in public opinion polls in Israel, there are 2 goals equally held. 1, return of hostages. 2, destroy Hamas. Those are 2. 90% of the Israeli population supports those stated goals. The support for 2 states is below 10%. It's said that essentially those are the 2 goals. Within the Israeli population, most Israelis want to see the hostages returned before the war concludes. There's about 30% of the Israeli population that says, forget any sort of ceasefire deal. The goal is to destroy Hamas. This is the more religious group in the population. This is the more religious Zionists are essentially saying hostages are secondary to destroying Hamas. We never want to have anything like this again. We don't want to exchange any more terrorist prisoners. We don't want any of that. We want to simply destroy Hamas, go right back in right now, forget about the ceasefire. But most Israelis are committed to the value of hostages being returned, both for obviously moral humanitarian reasons, but also for strategic reasons, because part of the fact that Israel has a citizen army, part of that commitment, patriotism, is knowing that the army has your back and will rescue you in all circumstances. So there is that desire. So many people in Israel assume that you get as close as we can to getting all the hostages back. And then after that's over, destroy Hamas. Now, of course, the problem with that is Hamas knows that. And so they are Hamas also faces a kind of existential difficulty. First, Hamas wants to keep as many hostages as possible. Hostages are their strongest leverage and weapon, bar none. We've seen that. Secondly, Hamas also wants to return to power. And the only way Hamas can return to power is if Israel withdraws its troops from Gaza. But the only way Israel withdraws its troops from Gaza is if Israel gets the hostages back. So this is really a catch-22 on both sides. It's really, and so generally from all the people I listen to and read, people who are more progressive left-wing, they are shocked that Netanyahu has agreed to how far we've gone already. You think about it, a couple of weeks ago, Trump said, if all the hostages aren't released on Saturday, all hell will break loose. That if Bibi was intent on invading Gaza and didn't really care about the hostages, then he would have gone right then and there. You had the incentive. So I think Bibi Netanyahu understands that the Israeli public wants hostages home and wants the war to continue until Hamas is destroyed, but the hostages in the meantime are more important, essentially. And there's some strategic truth in that. Hamas is much weaker than it was 16 months ago, and Israel is much stronger than it was 16 months ago. 16 months ago, Israel had troops on northern border and and in Gaza. And so on the northern border, there's relatively quiet. So the strategic thinking is time is on our side. Then you've got this entire shift with the Trump proposal. Now, this is it's very interesting. And again, of course, we can never know, but I actually think that Netanyahu and all of Israel were totally taken off guard and shocked by the proposal. If you look at Netanyahu's face, it does not seem that unless, of course, he's probably a very good actor. You think you have to be a politician. But my opinion is that this was not something that was pre-planned, or there could have been some discussion of it, but not, and that's Trump's style, as of course we know, they just talk off just from the hip. So anyways, but I think this might surprise some people, but in Israel, a recent poll by Channel 12 found, I want to get the exact statistic right, because this is a poll in 2000, or just from Channel 12, found that 70% of Israel's population, 70%, support the redevelopment of Gaza. That's a 70%. That's a pretty high percentage. Only 35% think that it's realistic. So that's
You can't get the sound to come on the TV.
That's the difficulty. But I think that
You do it with a regular one.
Groups that oppose the centrist parties, they've said it's an intriguing idea, but it's more important to get the hostages back. Where the spectrum of public opinion in Israel now, as I understand it, could be wrong, but the mainstream is where you place the value of returning hostages. On the far right, it is a minimal value. I mean, it's a value, but it's more important is going and destroying Hamas. Now, you wonder if they would think differently if the kibbutzim had been religious Zionist kibbutzim instead of more secular left-wing kibbutzim. I think that would have changed the calculus. But anyways, and then I think you have on the far left who think maybe Netanyahu just wants to continue the war to stay in power. And when there's probably some truth to that, but you have the centrist to moderate left that does not think that, does not want Hamas to stay in power, but believes the best bet would be to really focus on getting the hostages and then restart the war. And you could say, why restart the war? I think there is I think nobody wants to live next door to Hamas. And I think I think the perception is the only way there is no Hamas is if the war is fully finished. Or if this redevelopment plan has any legs, that in essence would, at least it wouldn't destroy Hamas, but it would rob Hamas of followers and human shields and all this. So that's the situation. And that it changes all the time. It could be, if hostages are returned as appropriate this week, then we could enter into phase 2. And if things keep going smoothly, it's not the right word, but that the promises are at least fulfilled, then we could get the deal getting closer and closer. And I think probably Netanyahu is thinking, I want to get as close as possible to all the hostages back. And then if we make a lot of progress, if we get 80% of the way there, then I can restart the war. I think that's how I'm perceiving it. And of course, he's also worried about his coalition. Right now, if the right wing were to leave the government, which some of them would, he has the support of the more moderates for a unity government. But if we restarted the war tomorrow, I think he would lose that support. So it's constantly shifting. It's constantly shifting. Now, what are the pros? So this idea of a redevelopment of Gaza and transfer of Gaza, expulsion, the transfer is, I guess, the sort of polite word or neutral word. This has actually been around for a long time. The most famous supporter of this policy was a rabbi named Meir Kahane, who was an American who made Aliyah and started a party called Kach. I don't remember how it's pronounced, but it was basically argued for forced deportation of Palestinians from the West Bank, and it was more focused on the West Bank. Gaza is not significant in terms of religion in the same way the West Bank is. The West Bank is very important biblically. Gaza is not. But this was a group that believed that, and eventually they were banned from Israeli politics. You could not, just like in Germany, certain political parties are banned, overt Nazi parties. In Israel, Koch was banned. Now, the cynics will say Likud and Netanyahu wanted to ban Koch so that they could get those voters. So there's always a political angle behind things. But regardless, this was not an idea discussed in polite society, polite Israeli society. You always had people on the sort of the far, like the Russian, the Avigdor Lieberman's party, which is a very ultra-right nationalist party, and on the ultra-right settler movement. There's always that might happen, but it wasn't really considered publicly. And then it's brought up. Now, let's look at, okay, I did debate in high school, so I can look at the positives and the negatives, even if I have strong opinions. So it's important to understand why the first reason that the proposal might be positive is that it restarts things. We really are right now in an intractable place. Let's imagine the ceasefire holds, and let's imagine the Israeli army withdraws, and people in Gaza go back to their homes. There aren't many homes. Yeah, it is rubble. Now you could say, okay, then let's focus on rebuilding. Let's focus on renovation, rebuilding. And that's possible. You can get funds from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has already promised $500 million for rebuilding. So that is an idea. But then what happens next? Hamas is not going to give up power willingly. So you rebuild and you have Hamas in power again, and there's another October 7th. So the idea is that there really is, given the current political reality, perhaps it needs to just be totally a total redo. That's one. The second reason to perhaps consider it is that as of right now, a Palestinian state seems to be off the table. I don't see, although it's interesting. Just read a speech from Ronald Lauder, who's the president of the World Zionist Organization, and who is probably also the moderate to right. And he was saying basically a two-state solution is still the only viable solution. But then you have many people today who say it's absolutely totally unrealistic, and most Israelis don't support it. And it would be crazy to even consider having a Jewish state next to a Palestinian state. And I think that is, to me, I think that's the dominant argument right now. I see that as something that I don't see that changing. So then what else do you do? And the third kind of, I guess you could say, support for it is, if Gazans are refugees, shouldn't they have the right to leave? Gazans really have. There have been some here and there. And if the Arab world cares about Palestinians, then they should admit Palestinians. You could actually, that many Jews left Arab countries 75 years ago, and they were expelled. And there have been, quote unquote, successful population transfers before, Greece and Turkey in the 1920s, and then there were Germans in Eastern Europe. So you could argue that there are precedents for this, and that it's the only chance there is for peace. Okay, so that's how you could say this is a potentially positive thing. On the negative side is, first, there's just the moral, I think that to many of us, the moral failure that this would represent. And that we know what it's like to be forcibly removed from places and pushed out, and that's not something that reflects our Jewish values at all. So just on a simple moral scale, even if some of it's voluntary, that it's just not something that's conceivable. I think that's the clearest feeling. Second would be, it is totally undoable, because there is no Arab country that will accept you. Yeah, that is. Now, one could argue, I'm going to take the devil's advocate. You could say enough money can solve many problems. And if the economic incentives are such that Egypt could get an extra $10 billion in aid if they build 6 towns away on the Sinai, you could argue that is a potentially solvable problem, but it seems like it's probably not. It does not seem, even for a large amount of money, I don't think for Jordan, accepting a huge number of Palestinian refugees is like an existential. That would be the death of the Hashemite kingdom. And then seeing what happened in Syria, I'm sure they don't want that. So you could say the impracticability of it. Third, who's going to oversee it? You think about that. the American public, I don't think, has any appetite to have American troops in Israel. Israel doesn't trust the United Nations. That's a non-starter. And so I don't think the I don't think the Arab countries are going to provide troops to forcibly remove other Arabs from Gaza Strip. So who on earth is going to oversee such a thing? So pragmatic, even if there were countries willing to be a refuge, how do you make that happen? So it's just, in many ways, it's like a spectacle. It's all sizzle, no steak kind of thing. That it sounds good in theory, and I think many people, I will tell you, as a rabbi, and people tell me things they may not say publicly, but many people who are pretty liberal and moderate in their views have told me quietly that, oh, maybe there's some good points here. So I'm just telling you, that's how many people see it, even if they don't say that. So I think there is a openness, there is a desire for a rethinking, I think is the broader, that people do realize that the current framework of two states, an Israeli state and a Jewish state and a Palestinian state, does not seem like it has much traction. And so perhaps we should start over with some different vision. But the problem is, like everything, in the details. Is there any way that you could make any progress on that vision? Maybe the vision is just to grind slowly, try to rebuild trust, have tighter security, try to bring the Palestinian Authority into Gaza instead of Hamas. Slowly, maybe we can't do 100% rethinking, but 1%, 1%, 1%, 1%. Maybe that's the more traditional approach. So that kind of is where I think we are right now. And it's hard to say, we all know this, it's hard to say if it's a serious proposal or not. It seems to be, but you never know. And there are different contradictory, I think Steve Witkoff, who is the emissary, just went to Israel and basically said, yes, we expect to go on to phase 2 of the ceasefire, and yes, Hamas will not be in power. I think those are two opposite things. So it's hard to know things change so quickly. We see how things change so quickly with Ukraine. It is astounding so I think that's we're at a real point of confusion. And if you, I guess I've already started to touch a little bit about this, but if you step outside and look at it more closely, I think October 7th really may be, outside of the founding of the state in 1948, maybe the most important date in Israeli history. I think society has changed. That Israeli society is in a very different place than what it was before October 7th. I think it triggered, especially now, as you watch the videos of hostages who lost 50 pounds and look like Holocaust survivors coming back. I mean, it triggers so much. And I think with so the psyche in Israel has really shifted. I don't think there are some, but I don't think that the sort of Israeli left and desire for peace and hope is really there. I think there's a kind of, especially even now after what happened with the Bibas family, I think there's just this horror and sense of loss. And also there's a feeling of unpredictability. You get this sense that Israelis love Trump, and I think that's generally true. I talked to my brother-in-law, who's a pretty secular guy, but I think there's also a kind of, things can change. He's so whimsical that things can change quickly. And I think that there's a determination to make sure in every way possible that something like October 7th can't happen again, just like Israel was created, or in part created, so that the Holocaust could never happen again. There is that feeling. And so I think that's going to shape how things happen, how Israel relates to the United States, how Israel relates to the world. So there's that famous quote that says, sometimes nothing happens for years and years, and then something like everything happens in 7 days, something like that. It's that there are moments in history where things change really quickly. And I think, and shift, and I think we're in one of those moments. I think it happened since October 7th, but even now, we're in some of those moments. Okay, I've got more, but I want to start. I know I've said a lot so far and we have a lot of questions, I'm sure. Yes.
Yes, use the mic.
Can somebody walk around?
Yeah.
Okay, when Trump announced that plan for redevelopment, I said, it's crazy. And there's no way the United States should be involved there, but the Arab world. But the idea, when that came out, I think Chicago story, that gentleman left,
Mm-hmm.
and they had a segment on the young lords of Lincoln Park, who I never heard of. Okay, and they became, those who don't know, they were the Puerto Rican equivalent of the Black Panthers,
Mm-hmm.
providing, medical assistance, all this stuff. And I'm thinking, people are all up in arms about, oh, these people, we can't move them, these places. I mean, we do it here all the time. It's called gentrification or urban renewal. You clear out Lincoln Park, you clear out the South Loop, you clear out the West Loop. People are worried about the Obama Library, what's gonna happen yet? Those people are gonna be forced out. So it's not such a strange, way out there idea. If, like you said, you give economic incentives, you build new towns, you build schools.
Yeah.
jobs.
I think it's an interesting analogy. It's an interesting analogy. I think the problem with it is if there were a transfer, is it voluntary or involuntary? That's what and in a sense, what you were saying is true in that when there's gentrification, it can feel involuntary. If suddenly your rent is doubled and your income isn't doubled, but technically it's still voluntary. So I think at least what makes me deeply uncomfortable with it, I can't speak, but a kind of forced deportation, even I think in a perfect world, it would be wonderful. We should have freedom of movement. You should be able to go where no one should have to live in a horrific place like that. But is that at all a realistic goal and dream? That's the problem. The question. Sure.
Alan, go ahead. Can you unmute yourself? Alan?
Yes, I think talking about this concept is not a valuable use of our time for 3 reasons.
Okay, good.
First of all, it's totally inhumane. Secondly, there's nowhere for these people to go. And thirdly, Trump was talking about it as a real estate deal, the way he thinks about everything else. Somebody will tell him that it's not realistic for real estate purposes. And therefore, I think we need to think about other things that could happen in Israel and Gaza rather than this off the top of his head idea.
Right. I think you're right. The only problem is I agree it's totally unrealistic, but it has a lot of support. And that's at least in Israel. I don't think most American Jews support it. I'm sure there's a percentage. That's a challenge. That's a challenge in that it's out there now. Okay, but maybe we can develop some better ideas here. Yes. Ed and Sue. Yeah, and then.
Sure, just as a quick comment, I am a reader of the New York Times.
Yeah.
And in the last week plus, the reporters from the Times said that is fading away. That whole idea of Trump taking over and doing a total redevelopment,
It was just for show.
it's drifting.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I think most smart people realize the not only the moral qualms, which I think some people feel more acutely than others, but the unrealistic nature of it. Okay, good. Yeah, so.
This isn't working.
Okay, I'll just repeat the question.
I'll speak as loudly as I can. So I have a question regarding the formation of a Palestinian state.
Mm-hmm.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but it's been my understanding that there was never a country called Palestine. It was just an area of a bunch of different Arab tribes until Yasser Arafat came and invented a Palestinian state. And it seems unrealistic to me to try to make a state that is separated by Israel in the middle of it. It never worked well before. How could they possibly think it would work again? It's gotta be contingent in with one area, or
You can there's certain ways you can connect the West Bank and Gaza, but I think you're getting at a very important point. this is very hard to discuss because in some ways, yes, it's true. In some ways, there wasn't a state called Palestine that was Palestinians, but that area was long called Palestine. And there were families and groups, clans that lived on the land for hundreds of years. So there are people that are close ties to that land. So if we've been here for that long and our families are all connected, and so it is the national. I think what Arafat did was ignite that nationalist feeling. And the truth is, this is part of the problem, which is where I agree with you in that the raison d'etre in many ways for a Palestinian state was the destruction of the Jewish state. It was a negative, in some ways, like the Tea Party was somewhat anti-British, the United States, although we're so far away. But in some ways, the Palestinian movement was a reaction to the success of the Jewish state, so it's not built as much on a positive vision. If there was a Palestinian vision if there was a vision for a Palestinian state that would live side by side in peace, I think that would make me more comfortable with the idea of Palestinian nationalism. So that's yes.
Gave up their mandate. The original plan was for a Palestinian state and a Jewish state, but all the surrounding countries said we're gonna chase the Jews into the sea and all attack the Jews, and every time the Jews had a war, they got more territory.
Yeah, so yeah, I yes.
Did have the idea of also Palestine.
Yes, and it was rejected by sort of Palestinian delegation. It's very complicated. Again, what happened back in 1947, 1948 is very complicated and very controversial. And when I talk about this with my mother-in-law sometimes, and she's more on the sort of, there are two different schools of historical thought. The traditional, which is probably what a lot of people keep getting feedback here. Okay, I have to turn this down. The traditional school, which was the more, you could call it sort of the Disney version of Israeli history, is probably that sounds like a pejorative. Vanessa, can you make sure everyone's muted? Because thank you. That the sort of Disney version is, it was a land without a people for a people without a land. And that's what a lot of people grew up with, but it's not really true. And the truth is, and then the other sort of myth was that all the Arabs who lived in Israel voluntarily left because they were told by Arab countries to leave for the war, and that once the war was over, they would come back. That's true, some did, but a lot were forced out. There's probably the Israeli historian who wrote the book on this, name is Benny Morris, and basically says about 700 Palestinians were forcibly expelled from their land, and that's true. I believe that evidence, that historical evidence. Now, what we do about that is a whole nother, that's in some ways the reality of war, but it does seem historically that's what happened. So then it does give a Palestinian narrative of suffering and history. So that can create a kind of nationalism. So again, I'm of the opinion, which I think most American Jews are, that in an ideal world, yes, you'd have a Palestinian state and a Jewish state. The problem is just that the Palestinian state is not, there are so many barriers to it. And now, see, every year that passes makes it less likely because there are more and more settlements. That's just how the country has grown. And a lot of the people who are settlers, they're actually not that ideological. Because there's a lot of government, you could have, it's like if you had $500,000, let's say, you could get a condo in Chicago, or you could come out and get a nice ranch house out in the suburbs and have a yard and everything. There are incentives in Israel to move to live in a settlement because you get more space, you get more bang for your buck. The schools are decent, they're newer housing. So in some ways that it makes any sort of deal even more impossible. That's where we are.
Mike, more than that.
Yes, Mike, go ahead.
So I'm not a fan of President Trump or his proposal, but I heard a great response from Marco Rubio. Not a fan of either.
He's more polished than Trump.
that, and his point was, look, that was the president's proposal, and if any of the Arab states want to put forth proposals, like, we're all ears to hear them. And much like in 1948, where there was just rejection of the idea of a Jewish state and an Arab state without proposal, and then again during the Clinton years, again, proposal with no counter proposal from the Arab states. So I think we're in this.
It is such.
This terrible, but that's not my question, or, because that was more just a statement. My question is this: in 2005, Israel withdrew from Gaza. In 2006, Gaza, Hamas was voted in as its leadership, as its government. Why does the world not recognize that as an attempt at a Palestinian state? A failed attempt, but still, why was there not a recognition of some sort of statehood there?
I think, first of all, I think that most people were not happy with Hamas winning, and the idea of recognizing a Palestinian state just in Gaza. This is not working now either. Yeah. I don't know. It looks like it.
Time job, just
like
doing the technology here. I got it.
So I'll just talk loud. That's okay. I got the rabbi's loud voice, but I think that was a huge disappointment back in 2006. And so you have a split between the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza, and they hate each other. So I think it was just unrealistic. The problem, I think the idea of a state, I think for Palestinians, a state would entail some sort of control over your borders and security. And I think in Israel, there's no desire or willingness to give Palestinians control over any sort of security or any borders. And so I think that is the issue. Thank you. Why a state? Why a state? A state won't work. Again, I did debate in high school, so I love looking at different ideas. I actually read President Trump's first ambassador to Israel, a guy named David Friedman, who was his bankruptcy lawyer, a very successful lawyer, and very right wing. And he wrote a book called One Israel, which is essentially one state. And his argument is that essentially a Palestinian area should be like Puerto Rico to Israel. The Palestinian area should be like Puerto Rico is to the United States, so that it is part of the United States, essentially, but self-governing on a local level and doesn't. So his concern, of course, is that if Palestinians were, or if Arabs were full citizens of Israel, there would be no Jewish state anymore because there'd be demographically. But he's a believer that there will be no Palestinian state. So what's some sort of middle ground is the Puerto Rico model. The problem with the Puerto Rico model, obviously, is one could easily make the charge that it is a form of apartheid. Now, I don't think apartheid's the right word because apartheid had different ramifications, but it is essentially second-class citizens. We know Puerto Ricans are treated, but it's horrible. On the other hand, it's safe. It's when there's not a hurricane. But so the idea is that, to me, that is the more realistic right-wing solution, which is where Israel may tend to. That if I had to put a crystal ball out for 3 to 5 years, which is just a terrible idea because it's so impossible. Who would have thought anything like October 7th was possible? But I would see something like no Hamas in power, some sort of Palestinian authority that operates in the West Bank and Gaza, and that Palestinian authority kind of operating in some ways like Puerto Rico operates in the United States. If there was any sort of political compromise between the right wing and the moderate wing, that might be what it looked like. And the crazy thing is that would have been considered a very right-wing solution 10 years ago. But now, compared to population transfer, that's a more moderate solution. So in some ways, and that actually reflects the evolution of Israeli society. You actually look at Israeli society, younger voters are more conservative. They voted in a very high percentage. So it's very interesting how this has reshaped. You know what a great podcast to listen to is? And it's probably tends on the little bit more conservative side, but it's called Call Me Back, which is a guy named Dan Senor. who wrote Startup Nation. Yeah, and he usually gets two reporters on. He'll get the more liberal reporter from Haaretz, and he'll get the more conservative reporter, Gal. And the two of them are great. They're just the two reporters, they disagree a lot, but they're both really smart and really well spoken and have a lot of good sources. So I learned a lot from that. And that's what they were talking about, how that political realignment has happened in Israel. Yes, let's go around. Jim, yeah, go ahead.
And you just started to touch on it a little bit, but the other component of all this is the West Bank. And so my question is, what's happening there at the moment, but B, where does that go? What's the end game for the West Bank?
No, it's so hard to say. I think the West Bank right now it is getting worse from what I understand. There's more violence, or there are more soldiers there now because soldiers were able to leave the north. And Hamas is more popular than the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. So it is, to me, that is the biggest problem. If you could identify this core problem that makes peace very difficult to attain. So there is a very far right in Israel, and that's absolutely true. But I do think with enough political will and realism, Israel could be dragged to a negotiating table. Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005. Things are different 20 years later than 2005, but I think the Palestinian population is still overwhelmingly supportive of destroying a Jewish state. There's just lots and lots of surveys. There's like something like 80% from what 80% supported the events. And why is that? Why is it? Well, I think in schools, is the narrative is a kind of anti-Israel feeling. And that makes any sort of deal eventually impossible. So what does that mean about the West Bank? The West Bank is more moderately governed. The Palestinian Authority has essentially been a good partner with Israel. In the grand scheme, if you want to just take it has been a relatively good partner. It has served Israeli interests. Unfortunately, they're not popular among the Palestinians because they're seen as too close to Israel. And they're seen as very corrupt, which I think the corruption part is true. So that's a big problem. I don't know how you get over a sort of intractable anti-Israel feeling among the Palestinian population. Again, not everybody. And in some ways, part of the dream is, again, I totally oppose Trump plan. I think it's absolutely unrealistic, and I'm not comfortable with at all forced deportations. However, if you think about the history of the Middle East over the last 60 to 70 years, you think about Dubai it's a very stratified society, but it is a peaceful society in some ways. And then you think what happened to Beirut, which Lebanon is a war zone, but until the 1970s, it was like the Paris of the Middle East. And so there is a kind of, with the right vision, there's a sort of optimism that you can create a better climate that doesn't have to be like this. Doesn't have to be like this. And there's blame to go around both sides. Israeli society has gotten more extreme as Palestinian society has gotten more. There's no question. But I think the real challenge is that sort of continuing feeling of hatred and these are my enemies and my identity is built on their destruction. That's the sad thing. Yeah.
Before I answer your question, you brought up our podcast.
Yeah.
And listening to it this week, they addressed the idea of developing Gaza, and I believe it was in Howard's podcast. And they said that Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, and Egypt are all developing their own Rivieras, and they have no interest in putting money into a possible competitor.
That's probably accurate. I think that's probably accurate. The world is definitely becoming more stratified, rich, poor, and what if you got a small percentage that's very rich, you can do exotic vacation. Why not? Yeah, that doesn't surprise me.
In today's New York Times, the foreign minister of Hamas, this was the headline, said, if we knew what was going to happen, maybe we wouldn't have started this war. Well, now, you know, to the rest of us, this is ludicrous. What did he think was gonna happen? My question to you is, what do you think the original end game was?
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's a great question. I think the original end game is how some of it, I think that, first of all, I think that I'm forgetting his name now, who was killed, the head of, yeah, someone. I think his original feeling was, first of all, I don't think he cares about Palestinian lives. I think that it's a death cult in some ways. So I think he knew there would be major civilian loss and loss of children and so forth. But I don't think he expected the sort of incredible ferocity of Israel's response, 2,000-pound bombs and so forth. And I think he thought that international pressure would slow it down. And then I think he thought the hostages were the greatest currency. And I think that turned out to be true. So I think it was not imagining the extent of what the destruction would be. And then also betting that things would end earlier than they have. I think probably the truth, people don't talk about this enough, but the Israeli economy is pretty miraculous. It has really not shrunk very much at all. It shrunk a little, I think it was like 0.7% or something, like it's incredible. The country is incredibly resilient. It's mind-boggling. Obviously tourism has declined, but overall. So I think that there was a feeling that this would tremendously divide and weaken Israeli society, and it really hasn't. Yes, there are divisions. There are protests. There's especially over hostages, but it's amazing actually how united Israel is in supporting freeing hostages. Because if you think about it, the costs are tremendous. To just looking at it objectively, to return 4 people for then 700 or whatever number of prisoners is incredible. You think about fair trades. But most Israelis support it, which is truly, Israel's got a lot of problems, but it is a very close-knit society. I think everybody has been affected by this. I was listening to another podcast, and then the person was talking about how he had just spoken with his sister who lives in Israel. And Friday mornings, you're shopping for Shabbat and everyone's talking to each other. And this was the Friday after the Bibas family, and everyone was just silent. It's like you buy your groceries. Usually if you buy from the same person, say, hey, how are you? I say, nobody's doing any of that. That is just this. So I think that there is a kind of unity that wasn't expected. Yeah, who else? Sarah, go ahead.
Thank you. I think Sinwar thought that maybe international opinion could be turned. The more killing there was in Gaza, the more violent Israel was, that the international community would, in a big way, turn against Israel. And I think that was part of the goal.
Oh, yeah. And in some ways that has happened, but in other ways, I think obviously the elections, but I think President Biden was extraordinary. Just in many, there were tips and tasks, but especially at the beginning, things got more, but especially at the beginning, I think he was incredibly supportive. And I think that was surprising probably to Sinwar, Hamas. I also think that Israel was so successful in decapitating Hezbollah that people didn't expect that would be so. Hezbollah was much stronger than Hamas. And so the kind of successful intelligence and attacks on Hezbollah, I think, shocked everybody. Same with the successful attacks on Iran. I think Israel, after October 7th, obviously, Bibi Netanyahu was not very popular, met one of the worst security failures in Israel's history. But I think in many ways, the way the war has played out has been very much to his benefit and militarily successful. The problem, again, I guess the core problem is nobody has a vision or a realistic vision, we could say, of what happens next. And that's been true for so long. That's been true. It is mind-boggling that we have 5 generations of refugees. It is mind-boggling. And that they're essentially there is a huge population of Palestinians that really are just, they're refugees, but living in these essentially cities that have been refugee camps. It's just such a, it's in many ways, you can keep kicking the can down the road, keep kicking the can, and just solve problems around the edges. I think that there's just nobody knows what to do. And I think that in many ways, before October 7th, there was a kind of feeling that the Palestinian problem is a manageable problem. In the sense that, yes, there's going to be violence, but there's a big fence, and we have really good high-tech security, and we can manage a lot on our own, and maybe there'll be flare-ups, but essentially Israel had succeeded in basically eliminating suicide bombings. Those were, I remember when I was there, it was happening every week. So Israel had managed, it was like a manageable problem. Then October 7th, and so then you could focus on peace with the wider Middle East, the Abraham Accords. But then October 7th totally shifted the narrative. So you could make the argument that from a Palestinian point of view, October 7th was an extremely successful. You could say that. I disagree. Obviously, if you care about human life, you would disagree. But you could say that it put the Palestinian cause on the map in the sense that it brought attention and it made Hamas popular, at least in terms of their fighting. So I think I agree, no one expected the kind of response that happened, but you could make an argument that if your goal is Palestinian sovereignty eventually and attention to the Palestinian cause, that it was successful. Horrific as that sounds. Yeah.
Go back to the Trump plan. I think as a real estate developer, he sees the possibility of a Riviera on the Mediterranean. But it's strange and crazy is that it was so off the wall, that proposal to people, that it was like good cop, bad cop. Because when he said, if all the hostages aren't back by noon Saturday.
Yeah.
Okay, and what happened? Netanyahu moderated. So it was good cop, the bad cop Trump, and now Netanyahu backed off a little bit. And
Right. I was actually surprised, very surprised by that.
there because, okay, we'll give those three on Saturday.
See, if you could see one sliver of positivity here, one sliver, there is actually good incentives for both sides. In fact, and if you want to include the United States, all three sides to stay engaged in the ceasefire. On the Israel, number one overriding goal, hostages back. Hamas, overriding goal, number one, stay in power. Trump, goal number one, win, have some sort of win. Yeah. So if then the ceasefire holds, you could say that it's a win. However, the way it's not a win is that Hamas stays in power. And from an Israeli point of view, that's a failure. But again, this is what they actually speculated on the show. And it's basically saying, okay, you get to the hostages being released and you get to a peace agreement, but then Hamas will inevitably violate the peace agreement. And then once that happens, you've all got all justification for going in and finishing the job. So I guess that is perhaps, if you want to make a bet, that's a sort of somewhat of a positive, if the ceasefire can continue to work, which it is. I did not think that it would get this far. I'm very positively surprised. So because Hamas wants to stay in power, because Israel wants to get hostages back, that can keep things going. That's my hope, at least. Other questions? Yes, Susan.
The negative affect Hamas that Qatar and all those other Arab states are no longer funding them? Because before the war, Qatar was funding them and then Netanyahu do it. He told them, keep sending the money, because he thought that having Hamas and the PLO against each other was better for him.
Oh, of course.
So he knew.
Whatever you want to say about Bibi Netanyahu, the man is extremely smart and absolutely, it was a perfect way to kind of undermine the Palestinian cause, to say they're really just Hamas. Because the Palestinian Authority was doing an okay job, but keeping Hamas as a foil, it's like you want your enemy to be as extreme as possible so that you can caricature them. So it's good politics. It's smart politics. So I think that's true. Now, Hamas, somehow it gets a lot of funding still even. I think that's part of the problem is so much of the money that was going to Hamas was used to buy nice condos in Qatar into tunnels. And so it is a problem. If like many of us, even if you see some value in the redevelopment plan, I think most of us are just so absolutely horrified by any kind of forced deportation. I think that, at least to me, it's such an emotional kind of thing. So in an ideal world, you would have massive investment, by Arab countries in rebuilding Gaza. Because I think there is value in thinking of Gaza as a positive place. Geographically, it is beautiful. It is, absolutely it is. So if there could really be willing investment in it. But then the other problem is then who controls the investment? Is it just is it an enclave where you have a rich Arab class and then you have essentially 95% of people are the poverty line, like how Dubai is? That's not great. Although from Israel's point of view, maybe that is really good because you've got it's like Israel sometimes benefits from having strongman leadership in neighboring countries. Because at least they like Hosni Mubarak in Egypt and al-Sisi. A strongman leader is often in Israel's best interest. In some ways, if there was a kind of commitment to creating a kind of Arab investment in the area, that would actually maybe a positive from Israel's point of view, but it does not seem realistic right now. Yeah.
We have a question. We have a question from online. There, from Janice, there is little left of Gaza, so who is going to pay to rebuild it?
The $64,000 question. I think in an ideal world, the Arab countries would. There is tremendous wealth. We know that. You look at Saudi Arabia, it's incredible how wealthy it is. And so in an ideal world, there would be investment in Gaza. And then this is another thing, you'd want Palestinian citizens there to have a sense of ownership. You don't want them to just like the gentrification idea. I don't want that. That may not be in the best interest of peace long-term, because if you have people growing up in a terribly impoverished environment with Israel right next door, that's not good either. So it's very hard to know what the right answer is for Gaza. And the sad thing is, the longer it goes on, the harder the problem is to solve. Like anything, I think if you go back and you think in 2000, if Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat and President Clinton had been able to reach a deal, that would have been almost the last time such a deal was possible. There were still lots of settlements, but not nearly the extent there are now. It's just the longer it goes on, the worse it is. And I think if you are a more right-wing Israeli, and the right wing in Israel is very strong, your general outlook is, we're just going to essentially be in occupying power for the foreseeable future. That it's manageable. There'll be lots of security. There'll be people who go back and forth. Everyone will serve in the army. It will be a sort of regimented existence. Whereas I think the dream before was much more open and partnership and almost like a vision of the European Union, but in the Middle East. That was the original vision of the Oslo Accords, that there would be some harmony and connection between Jews and Palestinians. That doesn't seem realistic anymore. So I think the alternative that a lot of more right-wing folks see is just almost like you call it a permanent occupation. It's not constant war. I don't think anyone wants it's constant low-level control. And I think that, I don't know, that seems right now to be the most likely outcome. And I think that makes America, there is a real problem among American Jews as well. I think October 7th really created, I think, more unity and solidarity. But as people start to think about what it looks like in the future, I think that there's going to be more and more division. And that's not good for our community either. And it creates its own set of problems. And I think we're already starting to see that. I think most American Jewish organizations are pretty opposed to any sort of Gaza plan from what I've read, but there are a few that have come out very strongly in support. So it's a confusing time. It is very confusing. I'm trying to provide some clarity, but I don't know if there is any other questions, concerns. Yeah, Mike.
Do you think that the other Arab countries Do you think the other Arab countries actually care about the Palestinians?
I don't think so.
Are they just being a fraudulent against Israel?
I think they don't. I think there's probably very little caring. But that doesn't surprise me. In politics, it's not really about, I wouldn't expect them to care. An ideal world, yes, but I would say that in most countries will operate based on their strategic best interests. And for a long time, it has been in the strategic best interest to be vocally supportive of the Palestinian cause, but in practice to do nothing. Because you've got a convenient foil, you've got Israel, and then you've got these victims. You say, look at this, if it wasn't for our strength, this is what would happen to you, just like it's happening to your Arab brothers. But nobody wants to actually accept Palestinians because in Jordan, it's the overthrows, it's an imbalance, already a larger population than the current ruling party. And Egypt, they already are worried about the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. The last thing they want is people from Gaza that could inflame more tension. However, I think in Saudi Arabia, I think from what I understand, Saudi Arabia just wants money and power. I think that their number one goal is money and power. And so if you can make it, Saudi Arabia wants there to be peace and stability so they can make more money and ship more oil. So if you can create some sort of incentive, but they also want to remain in power. So if Saudi Arabia just said, okay, we're just going to side with Israel, forget about the Palestinians, that would undermine the popularity of the sheiks in the Arab street, so to speak. So they can't do that. But I think they also want to make money. And if the economic incentives could align for there to be some sort of peace agreement, I think you would get it. They probably don't care about Palestinians, but it would be in their best interests. That's what Henry Kissinger was famous for, is trying realpolitik. Whatever is you got to figure out what do they want? How can we get it and deliver it to them and get what we want? And unfortunately, and this is the sad thing from a humanistic perspective, it's just so awful to see Palestinians are almost treated as like chess pieces. They're like, move around, whatever our interests are. And I think, unfortunately, that's how they have been for a long time. And I think that's why it's hard for me to think about Israel as I think in many ways, in an ideal world, Arabs in Israel would have more rights in Israel than in many Arab countries. That's not the case right now. But it is not, the Palestinians have just gotten short shrift for all this time. Now, of course, they haven't done a lot to help themselves either. But it has been like chess pieces on a board. And that's just, from a humanistic perspective, just so sad and tragic in a way. Yeah.
Before we go on, we're probably sitting here and saying, what can I do? There is something you can do. You can vote, and I'm just gonna share.
Oh,
the
good.
screen
Yeah,
here.
yeah.
You can vote in the WZO, World Zionist Congress, WZC, and you can take it takes $5 to vote, but it's $1 billion of money. You need to vote for the Reform Movement slate. We know many people on that slate, between all the clergy and educators here. We know a lot of those people, and this is a fantastic thing. It's from March 10th to May 4th, and our own voting maven is Rich Amen. Raise your hand, Rich. Thank you. And if you have any questions, you can either see me or Rich, preferably me. Yes, we're gonna send out an email. I'm looking at the flyer right now, but it's your vote for. Oh, flyer, okay, outside this flyer's on the table. This is your vote for Israel's future. This isn't a vote in their election. This is a vote for where does the money from the WZO get passed along, but it's a lot of money.
Yeah. It's great. It's very important. Unfortunately, Israel is becoming a more sort of conservative religious society. Not totally, because it's interesting. Most Western countries have a declining birth rate. We're below. Israel is like the only Western country that really doesn't. Israel averages 3 kids. So even, obviously Orthodox have more kids, but Israeli secular families often have 3 kids. So it's actually, there is still a strong liberal population, but it's this, the people who move to Israel, most people who make Aliyah are Orthodox, especially from the West, especially from a place like the United States. And so what, if we feel a connection, we should be representing certain reform liberal values. I'll never forget one time when I was in, so we all spend our first year in Israel, first year of rabbinical school in Israel. And so that was 2001, 2002. It was great. So the school, if you've ever been, it's beautiful, right? Best part of Jerusalem, and next door to the King David Hotel on one side, and then another real fancy hotel on the other side. And I used to work out at the real fancy hotel. They had a nice gym. I would see Bibi Netanyahu there. He wasn't prime minister at the time. He was out of office, but there was always a running limousine right outside the main door when he was there. And then when you walked in, you had these 2 huge guys. And so Ehud Omer, who's the mayor of Jerusalem, he also worked out there. But one day he came and he talked to the students, and he came in and he said, we talked about how happy he was to have the Reform Seminary and so forth. And then people asked him, well, why don't you honor the rights of Reform Jews in Israel? Because at that time, Reform rabbis, Reform communities got no money from the government. They since get a little bit, but the Orthodox communities are highly subsidized. And it was a very interesting answer. He basically said, if you want more money, come and live here and vote here and you'll get more money. But until that happens, you're not going to. And to us as Americans, we believe in certain fundamental rights. The whole Constitution was written to protect the rights of the minority. You read the Federalist Papers, that's the whole idea of filibusters, they're meant to protect minority voices, that in a total majority rule society, it's awful. And we're going towards that direction, but the whole point of the Constitution was to protect minority rights. Israel doesn't have that kind of structure. It's purely political. It's how many votes can you turn out? How much power do you have? And so I think that has made these issues harder for us Reform Jews who care about liberal values. It's harder to relate to what's going on in Israel. And that continues. I'm a very optimistic guy. Everyone who knows me knows that, but it seems like there's just not much cause for optimism in many areas right now. I don't think the reform movement in Israel is growing like it used to. And so providing that support, which this does, is a good idea. Any other questions, concerns? Yes. Susan, please. Oil and gas, I don't think so. I don't think so. I think there's natural gas that Israel has accessed with fracking that is shared with Egypt. There's some sort of deal, from what I understand. I don't know all the details. Yeah, the economic ties are really, there is something to be said. One of the reasons the peace agreement with Egypt has held up is the economic ties. And that's another miracle, that it's almost 50 years. That agreement through thick and thin has held up. So there is precedent. And when you have economic ties, I think in the long run, most people want to live a comfortable life. Even if you think about it. My wife and I were talking about this recently, because we were talking about the idea of Palestinians. And we were trying to understand, why is there so much anti-Semitism still among the population in Gaza? So high, 80%. When you actually don't, that's not really true among Palestinians in the United States. I think the war has certainly inflamed things, but it's not this level of hatred. You could go to PETA Inn, for example. If you go to PETA Inn, it's owned by Palestinians. You could go there, you could wear a yarmulke. I don't think most people would, but it's not there. Even in Arab areas, the Congress people in Detroit, there's a very pro-Palestinian district right next to a Jewish, and they're friends. There is something about America that at least can create closer bonds. You're not going to be best friends, okay? But there is, and I think part of that is just economic. There's more likelihood to make a living, have a house, and you're not living in, dire poverty. So there is something about money solving certain problems. And I think that's a positive. I just don't know how we get there. Well, thank you, everybody. What a great discussion. And I'll see you next month.
Our discussion next month will be March 17th, and you'll get a flyer, and I'll have the title of what Rabbi.
Everybody has their biases. Yeah. And I think the biases here is we know better